Hey guys, so instead of doing a large patch video where I just go over the patch notes in an hour or two, I decided to do a series of videos focusing on a few particular changes going on in the preseason. The first change I'm going to go over are the tank item changes, because Riot decided to push tank items because tanks have been, well, let's be fair, pretty bad the last season. I'm going to go over those changes item by item. By not having a large video that I just briefly go over every change, I'm hoping that I can go a little bit more in depth, well, a lot more in depth, and give you guys a real feel for it. I also want to make sure that in a month or 2 or 3 or 5 from now, if people go back and they watch this video, they can still get the general idea. Even if an item is 10 less MR or 10 more MR, they can get the idea of what's going on with the change and know what the item is for. So, as always, make sure to like and subscribe, and let's go over all the tank changes that are happening. So, first up, we have Bammy Cinder. Now, to read this change literally, now also executes minions that would be killed by 1 or more ticks of Immolate. What does that mean? If it does 15 damage and a minion has 30 HP, it just kills that minion. That's it. Basically, tanks could get less CS. In fact, they did get less CS than other classes because Bammy Cinder and some other stuff had some RNG that often wonkily lost you some CS. Obviously, a class having less CS than other classes, basically by default, you could make the argument that, oh, well, it's your choice, you need to play better, blah, blah, blah. It also just meant that tanks just sort of got less CS, and yeah, so they're going back and they're giving it a little bit of an adjustment to ensure that tanks don't lose as many CS as they do, and that's it. That's all it does. It's a good change, and it probably will never be changed back because it's just a fine change. Next up is Frostfire Gauntlet. A lot of people don't really understand this change. They're looking at this and they're thinking something was changed or added or removed or replaced. No. Basically, Frostfire Gauntlet, whenever you do the attack that proxy slow, you just get a little nuke. 20 to 100 with 0.5% max HP. 0.5% is extremely small. That means for every 1,000 health you have, it adds 5 damage. If you have 5,000 health at max level, this will hit for 150 magic damage. It's not contributing a lot of damage. However, what it is doing is it's adding a little bit of magic damage that a lot of tanks actually needed, and I suspect that some tanks might get toned down because of it. Right now, all that it did, nothing was removed, nothing was changed. All that it did was it gained the little bit of damage on hit. That's it. The slow is the same, the duration is the same, the area is the same, everything is the same. It just only gained a little bit of damage every 4 seconds. Personally, I think that champions like Tahm Kench are likely finally going to see a nerf because often tanks only really needed a little bit more damage to get a kill. I mean, how many times have you fought a tank and you've gotten out by just a little bit of HP, or you beat them by just a little bit of HP? Well, often this is that little bit of HP that they're going to need to get that kill. Tanks tend to have very limited damage and, you know, just use their abilities and try to kill you in that time. Giving tanks that little bit more damage, yeah, again, sometimes that's all that a tank champion needed. So, good change, good. Well, is this a good change? It's a buff. They did buff the item. Do I think it needed it? Riot did, so there you go. Turbo Chem Tank is the one that has received the biggest change that we've gone through so far. Everything is unchanged, except it lost the passive magic damage, and now, much like a Dead Man's Plate, you get a big, I shouldn't say big, you get an AoE nuke on your next attack after moving for a certain amount of movement. Your movement speed and your health contribute to how much damage it does. It does more damage to jungle minions and, well, lane minions. Personally, I think this has made it extraordinarily weak. It lost a lot of damage. They tried to compensate by making the mythic passive stronger. So instead of only 5 ability haste, it now gives 5 ability haste and 50 health. That's probably fair considering how weak the scaling is on this item. My personal opinion, that was a lot of damage that it lost. It went from 1% health damage per second to 1% health damage only when you proc it. Now, This is probably a change because having an item that could clear jungle monsters really well, then also gave you a movement speed active that allowed you to gank, that was really, really overpowered. That was really overpowered, and the item got nerfed into the goddamn ground because of it. Unfortunately, this basically nerfed it even farther, and I suspect they're going to go back and rebuff it. But for now, it does seem like they were trying to fix the issue. You can't have a jungle item, or I shouldn't say, you can't have an item that ganks really well and allows you to clear the jungle really well, because then every jungle tank that can gank gets extremely good ganks and also chain clears the jungle, and that's broken. So, personal opinion, I suspect the health ratio on this will be like quadrupled. Going from 1% health damage per second to 1% total per proc, that is an extremely large nerf. Even with the movement speed, that's 3%. That means if you're Hecarim and you're chugging along at 600 movement speed, what is 3% of 600? Yeah, that's 18. That's 18 damage. With 1% max health, that means a 4,000 health Hecarim gets 40. Plus, oh wow, 18. That's 68 here. Plus that's 186 in total. That's a very good situation. That is a lot of movement speed and a lot of HP, and this thing can't even clear 200 damage. So yeah, this item, personal opinion, I think it'll probably get a sizable buff. Now the mythic passive, yeah, I can talk. The mythic passive did get a large buff, which maybe that offsets it, but for now it'll probably be too weak. In the future, this is basically what they did with the item. So I maybe was a little bit too specific about it right now, but as for right now, I probably wouldn't build it. In the future, when it gets buffed, yeah. So if you're coming back to this video in like 3-4 months, I would probably go check if they buffed it. Sunfire Aegis is getting a direct buff. That's all they're getting, it's just a direct buff. The armor is going from 30 to 35, the magic resist is going from 30 to 35 also, and the mythic passive is gaining 50 HP. This mythic passive was possibly one of the weakest mythic passives in the game. 5% slow resist and 5% tenacity. At max stacks, that's 20% slow resist, 20% tenacity. That's way too late in the game to build for that, and that just doesn't... It felt weird and weak, and like it didn't really do anything until you were at 3 or 4 items. I think it's fair that they buffed the mythic passive because Sunfire was particularly good when you built it, not so much later in the game. They did buff it right when you built it though, which I feel was a little bit unneeded. They probably won't go back and nerf it. It's you have to remember, in changes like this, they're not... It's such a small change that even though in my opinion it was unneeded and could be reverted, I don't think it'll ever be broken enough that they'll have... Like, I don't think it'll ever be in a situation where they go back and nerf it, because it's just not that big of a buff, even though again, I think it was unneeded. So you'll probably see more people going Sunfire. A lot of people were going for Frostfire over here just because Sunfire wasn't particularly needed. Tanks don't often want damage. Having more CC is great. And to be honest with you, Sunfire does take a while to stack in a meta when most people are getting one shot. So more HP and more armor and more MR will probably allow you to live longer to stack it up more, particularly later in the game. But as of right now, Void Staff still is overpowered. Lord Dominic's Regards is still overpowered. And playing a tank later in the game means you're still going to die extremely easily no matter what you do. So this item will probably still struggle later in the game when you're just dying way too fast. That isn't to say that it's a bad item though. I think it'll still be a good item. I just don't think that these changes... It's not this item's fault that tanks as a whole are weaker later in the game. I'm just trying to explain why a lot of people would prefer Frostfire just to get out that immediate slow rather than wait to do more damage, as later in the game you might not live to do that more damage. Abyssal Mask is receiving a very large change. Its cost is going to be pretty cheap at 2,700, 450 HP, a tiny bit of ability haste at 10, a tiny bit of magic resist at 30, but it's getting the old Abyssal Scepter passive. If any of you remember, Abyssal Scepter was an old item that had an aura that reduced people's magic resist. It was removed because mages were abusing it, and so Riot finally decided they were going to go back and take another shot at it. So how have they tried to balance it? So tanks build this item, particularly magic damage tanks who want to squish squishies, but the actual mages like Kassadin don't go and buy this item. Well, the magic resist is quite small at 30, but you get 7 per person around you. Now, the aura is pretty small unless you have Malphite ulted into 5 people. Very unlikely you're going to hit more than 2 to 3 people with the aura. So, reasonably, if you're 1v1ing, you only have 37 magic resist. With 2 people, you're at 44. With 3 people, you're at 51. So, if you're in a team fight, if you're within multiple people, it can give you a decent chunk of magic resist. But it's highly unlikely you're going to get to the 65 from being around 5 people. I very much doubt that. Additionally, the magic resist reduction is 5 plus 1% bonus health. That means by default, by just building this item, you will get 8.5. Is that 8.5? No, 9.5. 9.5. My bad. So that's not really that much. However, once you get 1500 bonus health, because it gives a max of 20 magic resist, you can't just play Scion and reduce their, I guess Cho'Gath might be a better example. You can't play Cho'Gath and reduce their magic resist by 50, okay? It's got a max of 20. Once you reach 1500 bonus HP, it reduces MR around you by 20. So, it's a pretty good tank item. And it's a pretty good tank item for tanks who want to build a good, cheap item to squish squishies with. If you're playing Cho'Gath, if you're playing Malphite, if you're playing Ornn, these sorts of champions can build this item and reduce their opponent's MR by a decent chunk, not amazing, but a decent chunk, while also getting a pretty good amount of magic resist. Is it a great item? I don't know. One of the reasons Abyssal Scepter was way good back in the day is it actually added so much damage that tanks could build it and really start putting a lot of work into squishy targets. Right now, it seems there's not so much emphasis on the magic resist, but often with how useless magic resist is as a stat, and a lot of the times you won't be fighting magic damage, it remains to be seen if it's going to be useful. However, if you do need some magic resist, and you do want to do more damage to squishies, if you want to kill the Misfortune while not dying to the Malzahar, this is a pretty solid item for that. A good chunk of 450 HP. Tank items have really had low health lately, so getting a tank item with a real amount of HP is really helpful. 10 ability haste. Tank items have not had the most ability haste. And yeah, up to 20 magic resist reduction. This is actually, in my opinion, I think this is a pretty solid item, but it'll be seen if it actually is as solid as I think it is. However, again, I'm a big fan of Abyssal Scepter coming back into the game. This item is named Abysmal Mask because it was based on Abyssal Scepter. So that item going back into the game, although now it's called Abyssal Mask, which just forget it, is good. There are tanks who do want to do more damage while still itemizing for some defenses. There should be room for all classes, including tanks, to itemize not just for pure damage or pure defense, but for some, way in between those two. Now, for tanks who finally want their Fuck Mages item back in the game, this is your Fuck Mages item. This item, Force of Nature, now gives 70 magic resist and the Steadfast effect. The Steadfast effect reads, whenever you take magic damage, you get a stack of Steadfast. Whenever you are immobilized, you get 2 additional stacks of Steadfast. So, if you take an Annie Q or a Cassiopeia ult or a Xerath stun or any of those sorts of things, you get 3 stacks instantly, with an additional stack every magic damage from there on. So if you get stunned twice, it would just instantly stack. Anyway, at 6 stacks, you take 20% reduced magic damage and get 10% increased movement speed. With the 5% movement speed by default, that's 15% movement speed. In other words, this item very much fucks mages. That's what it's good for, right? The downside of this item is unless you do a lot of magic damage, it does nothing. If you can't stack it, if you're Olaf or Xin Zhao or Darius or even champions like Jax just will not stack. I mean, there's no way Jax is going to hit you with 6 ults and Ws in any reasonable amount of time. We all got that, right? So unless you're fighting dedicated mages and multiple of them, this item can feel a bit weak. Now, there are some solo mages like Ryze or Cassiopeia who will stack this on you pretty quickly, so it's good at what it does. This item reads, fuck mages. You know, that's what it does. Fuck mages. But it has some serious weaknesses that its prior iterations from previous seasons didn't have. In other words, this item's very good at what it does, but it's extremely niche. It's so niche that it might not even be good at what it does from being too niche. But it's very good at what it does. Now, Knight's Vow is an item that a lot of the low-ranking people don't tend to see because this item tends to be more popular at the higher ranks. At the lower ranks, people tend to build more selfishly. At the higher ranks, a lot of people who play any sort of tank in the top lane, in the jungle, even some bruisers, rarely, would go Knight's Vow. Not so much last season, but in the seasons before that, you would see this item pretty frequently. They're changing it to nerf the health regen bonus. Instead of 300% bonus health regen, it's going down to 150%. Instead of only being damage return and some wacky movement speed if your ally is low HP, it now redirects 10% of the damage they take to you, and you heal 8% of the damage they do. That means, effectively, you put this on an 80 carry, you heal for 8% of what that 80 carry does in damage. Okay? If they have less than 30% health, you redirect 20% of the damage they take. That means that if they're low and you kind of have that weird, ability to get them to stay alive, I don't know, it's not really weird. It's just, you can help the 80 carry stay alive from a little bit of burst, but it's less good at just keeping your 80 carry topped off at high HP the entire fight, because the 20% health, or the 20% damage redirect only activates if they're below 30% health. Overall, they're giving it back the damage heal that it used to have from previous seasons, which is good. It was really unnoticeable, but it was just kind of a nice feeling when you could, keep an 80 carry alive and do well for them, and you would take the damage they would take, but then you would heal it back, and, that felt nice. But, other than that, it's not really changed that much. The effect is a little bit stronger, but there's a little bit less health regen. Yeah, not the biggest deal. Not really even that noticeable of a change, really, end result. I suspect it'll still be popular at the higher ranks and totally unseen at the lower ranks. Now, the last of the changes before we get to the new tank item, I think it's only one item, is Aegis of the Legion. Aegis of the Legion is going down by 100 gold. Why? Because during the last preseason, they had it out, then they reduced its ability haste from 15 to 10 and never adjusted its total gold cost. Its total gold cost was as if it still had 15 ability haste. That made it one of those wildly inefficient items the entire season. You might have noticed whenever you build Aegis of the Legion, you probably thought to yourself, damn, why does this item suck so much? They literally forgot to address its gold cost after they removed the 5 ability haste. It took them an entire year, but they're finally addressing it, which is just, wow. Now, because a lot of you guys can't figure this out, let me be extremely clear on what is happening with these two items. Aegis of the Legion is going down by 100 gold. Gargoyle's Stoneplate is therefore then going down by 100 gold. Does that make sense to everybody? Because if its component goes down by 100, then the total cost to build the item goes down by 100. Locket of the Iron Solari is having the combined cost go up by 100. So Locket of the Iron Solari will cost 0 more gold because its component is going down by 100 and then its cost is going up by 100. Negative 100 plus 100. 0 change. Everybody got that? This is going down by 100. Gargoyle's Stoneplate was probably a little bit too weak. In fact, it definitely was too weak. Locket of the Iron Solari was fine. No change. Everybody got that. It's not that difficult to understand, but for some reason, every time this happens, there are so many people going down and are saying, why are they nerfing Locket of the Iron Solari? It didn't need to be nerfed. They're not nerfing it, okay? No change. Lastly, the last thing here is a new tank item being added. Winter's Approach and Fimbulwinter. There's a new item that's pretty cheap. It builds out a Tear the Goddess, so obviously it's the Tear Goddess mana stacking mechanic. Decent chunk of health, pretty good chunk of mana, decent ability haste. You gain bonus health equal to 8% mana, so you end up typically 600-ish HP with this item. Once you have it stacked up, on an 8-second cooldown, you can gain a shield. The shield is increased by 80% if more than one enemy is nearby. Now, I have seen some misconceptions going on here. The shield only scales based on your current mana, not on health. You can't go this item on Sign or Cho'Gath and gain a 10 billion strength shield. If more than one enemy is nearby, it'll typically be somewhere around 400 to 500 strength. It's on an 8-second cooldown. This is not an 800 spammable shield on a 3-second cooldown. It doesn't give any defensive stats. So if you're the sort of champion who has high defensive stats already, but doesn't have a heal or a shield or some way to make use of those defensive stats, in other words, if you're Ornn, this item's pretty good. For the majority of other tanks, it can take a long time to stack. The lack of armor and magic resist can become noticeable. But it is a pretty decent item. It's pretty cheap, it's pretty decent. Stat wise, it seems to be doing fine in the first couple of days of the preseason. It's okay, it's a bit niche. It's more niche than people realize just because you have to actually stack it up. But yeah, it's a decent item. Health and a shield. So if you're Ornn or a champion who already has good defensive stats, who needs a heal or a shield or some way to make use of those stats, this item's pretty good. And those are all the tank changes in the preseason. So thank you all for getting all the way through here. Make sure to like, make sure to subscribe, make sure to leave a comment down below talking about it. Make sure to join my Patreon. The description is in the link. That's extremely beneficial and helps me make these videos. It's my birthday today, and I'm hoping I made this video pretty well. So if I did, leave feedback. If I didn't, also leave a feedback. But there you go. Thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being here. I'll go through some of the other things about the preseason as the days come. Hopefully pretty quickly, but these sorts of videos take longer to do, and there's a lot to go through. So we'll see. At the very least, I think the tank item was probably the most important thing to go over. So, thank you for watching. Thank you all for being here. Have a great day, everybody. Bye-bye.